Hello, students, and welcome to Chapter 4, The Evolution of a Black Aesthetic. And what this is referring to is we're still going on the idea of African American artists carving out their own niche and developing their own sense of style and sense of what kind of aesthetic they want to have in their artwork. So I am not going to go through every single slide on this presentation because it's a very long slideshow. What I am going to do is hit the highlights so that you will know what you need to look at in the regular PowerPoint when you're studying up for your quiz. So here we go. These are some terms from Chapter 4. Maybe a few of them are mentioned in the quiz, not really a lot, but they are words that you should know in regards to this. And a lot of the definitions are embedded in the slideshow, and they're also on your vocab lists as well. So, of course, everybody knows that the 1960s was a time of great change in this country. We had the civil rights movement going on. We had a very unpopular war happening in Vietnam. People were mounting protests. There was a lot of high inflation. There was very high unemployment. So many things were going on. It's actually a period not unlike what we're going through right now. I think there were just more hippies and drugs. So Ralph Ellison wrote The Invisible Man in 1952, which was 8 years prior to 1960, but he's basically talking about the invisibility of the Black person in American society and trying to fight against that and cope with that or find a way, a solution. And we also have the landmark decision in 1954 of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, which desegregated schools. And a lot of that law was being rescinded or undermined in various states throughout the United States, and that led to some riots in various states. Again, so there were lots of protests, lots of riots, lots of civil unrest, lots of people trying to agitate for change. And by the 1960s, nonviolence was not necessarily seen as something that was effective in combating all of the inequities that were going on. And so some people became much more militant. We have the rise of the Black Panthers. We have the rise of Black Pride. We also have feelings that were kindled by Marcus Garvey and the Pan-African movement back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So, as I said, many things happening. We have the rise of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and the assassinations of both of those men, as well as Robert Kennedy and the freedom workers who were murdered in Mississippi. So I'm basically setting this up to say to you, this was a tumultuous time, and artists, it's a tough time to live in, but it's in many ways a good time to be an artist because artists make great art during difficult times. And so one of the things that is on your quiz is a question about the Spiral Artists Group. What I want you to do is to have a look-see. There, I mentioned it maybe once or twice, I think. So there's a list of artists in this slide of who is in the group, and you'll notice there's only one woman. And later on, we have another woman who reacts to that, so we'll come back to that. But Hale Woodruff had suggested to this group that they call the group Spiral as a symbol for the group, a particular kind of spiral, because from a starting point, it moves outward, embracing all directions, yet constantly forward. And there was a spur to action, March on Washington, 1963, and at the same time there was a large exhibition held in downtown Manhattan with this work, Norman Lewis, Processional, in his abstract expressionist style. He had done in Chapter 3, The Woman in a Yellow Hat. Very different style. Again, artists go through changes throughout their careers. And although this is abstract, you do get the feeling of people marching, and it also is in black and white, and it's also very big. So I'm going to kind of, as I said, not go through every single slide, but I hope that you will read them and I hope that you will look at this carefully because, as I've mentioned previously, your final paper for next week is to choose an artist and write about that artist and their work. So I hope that you will look through this slide program on your own, and maybe you'll want to choose one of these artists because there's a lot of great art that was made during this period of time. So I mentioned Romare Bearden, and I think I also mentioned in a previous slideshow that he wanted to do a collective project with the entire group and that they should contribute to it by using collage technique. They were totally not into it, but he was totally into it. So he started to take clippings from magazines that were popular at the time, like Life, Ladies' Home Journal, and Look, and he would create these photo montages that he would then enlarge using a photostat process, and he called them projections. And so this work was very autobiographical in a lot of ways. He was looking at both urban Black life, the urban Black life that he was living as an adult, and the disappearing rural Southern Black life that he had lived as a child. And he created a series called The Prevalence of Ritual Mysteries. And essentially what he's saying is that he is looking at the things that people do in their lives, the things that mark the rhythm of the seasons, the things that mark the rhythm of the days. And he had previously been working somewhat abstractly. And so, as he says here, people started coming into my work, and you can see their faces in these images. So, as I said, I'm going to move into the things that you really need to know for the quiz, but I do want to pause here and look at this work because this is from the Prevalence of Ritual series. It's called Tidings. And if you know your Bible story, you'll remember that the angel came to the shepherds who were freaking out about the star in the east, I believe, and said, I bring you great tidings of joy. So if you look carefully at this picture, this is an angel. You can see she has a wing right here, and she's holding a rose and she's handing it to this young woman. And so the angel is coming to Mary to tell her that she's going to have baby Jesus. And so basically what that means is he's taking a theme that has been covered many, many times by many artists, particularly in the Renaissance, and he is giving them the characters black faces, and he's giving the story an African American feel. And there's a church and a train in the background, and those are images that pop up in Romare Bearden's work quite a lot: trains and churches. And I talked previously about the three folk musicians. So there you can see it again, a slightly better image of it actually. Let's see. So we're going to see a lot of things that look very difficult here, but we'll move on because we need to. Benny Andrews. There is what's interesting going on. Artists are mixing their media a lot more. During this period in American art, actually, abstract artists had been very popular. And the thing about abstraction is they often were trying to completely remove the presence of anything about the artist himself or herself or the artist's life. They wanted to just have form and color. And for African Americans at this moment in time, that was kind of impossible because there was so much that needed to be spoken about what was happening to African Americans' lives. So this is Southern Pasture, and he would use things like fabric and cut up bags and other types of materials to create things. And so this is one of his more famous pieces, The Champion, where he took a beaten up old lunch bag and he formed it to create the boxer's face in this, and also kind of showing that it's about cultural identity because a lot of young African Americans could only escape poverty through sports. Of course, I mentioned the Black Panther party, and also artists were creating a lot of assemblages and images from things that had been found in the riots. So this is one of Noah Purify's works, creating an assemblage from things he found after the Watts riot in Los Angeles. Let me move ahead. Do read about Benny Smith, because he really wanted to find Black people in art history and figure out how to bring them into African American art history. So Faith Ringgold, I mentioned the Spiral Group earlier. So Faith Ringgold was very unhappy with the art community, not just because of the lack of representation of Black artists, but also the lack of representation of female artists. So, in response to the fact that Spiral had not only rejected her, but only included one woman in their membership, she created her own group, Where We At. And she really wanted to have a space where women could show their work, particularly African American women. And I mentioned in my previous slideshow that she liked to do textile art because it became a way, another way of expressing herself. Quilting had become quite a Black woman's medium or idiom, and also because it's a lot cheaper to ship than large canvases such as this. So a lot of her work of the 60s features racial conflict and discrimination. And we looked earlier at The Flag is Bleeding. And then this painting, I'm not going to say the name of it, but you can read it both in the image itself and also in the caption there. And she was using the American flag a lot. And so it's very pessimistic, and she was concerned with color and what the color Black had come to stand for. And so she saw Black as something that contained within it all the colors, and that because of that, it denoted presence. And so she says, Black art must use its own color Black to create its own light, since that color is the most immediate Black truth. David Hammons, using the flag in the background of his work, flag was used a lot by artists in the 1960s. So Betty Saar, this work of art is referred to in your quiz very directly. So what's interesting about Betty Saar is she creates assemblages like this, which I'll go back, to talk about intense feelings about racial stereotypes. And so the liberation of Aunt Jemima, here she is arming Aunt Jemima. If you look in one hand, Aunt Jemima's carrying a broom. She's looking like the stereotypical image of the mammy. And in this image here, probably from an Aunt Jemima box or some other sort of thing, the Black maid holding the white baby. But in one hand, she's got the broom and, oh, a pistol. Look, there's a pistol. And also a rifle. So, and I think these are meant to represent maybe laundry suds. And then behind her, all the packages from Aunt Jemima's maple syrup. So here she is trying to subvert that notion and like literally giving Aunt Jemima the tools for her own liberation. So it's meant to kick back against stereotypes. And then this piece, she uses an actual window that she puts images behind, Black girl's window, basically saying that this young woman, she wants out of a box and into the world. But at the same time, the images that are on the panels of that window show Saar's interest in things like palmistry, voodoo, phrenology, shamanism, and so forth. And so she's very interested in art and the spirit. And later on, we will see how she works with her daughter, Allison, to create artworks, when that is also in your quiz. So, as I said, I hope that you will read these on your own. Elizabeth Catlett, very important artist. This piece became very iconic in the late 1960s, early 70s. Homage to My Young Black Sisters, where she's got this beautifully polished wooden gleaming figure of a black woman raising her fist. And she did a lot of really important work around civil rights and also women's rights. And she really wanted to, the women's movement in a lot of ways was created by white women and often led by white women. And she wanted to bring, more black women into it and go with the strength of, her younger sisters. And here you can see two images. You can't really look at sculpture effectively without seeing it from all sides. David Hammonds is an art critic, and he looked at Melvin Edwards' minimalist sculptures. Now, minimalism is an art movement where you're reducing everything to its absolute minimum. And a lot of people, because of the 50s and 60s and the types of abstract work that were being made in the 60s, where you don't want to have anything about the artist or the artist's biography in it, led people like David Hammonds to think, I didn't think you could make abstract art with a message, and yet you can. So here's Melvin Edwards. And this is the iconic piece that I mentioned in the quiz. It is called The Gate of Ogun. Ogun is the West African Yoruban god of iron. He's also a god of war. He's also a god of all metals. So it's really appropriate that this gate should be made of metal, and it's beautiful burnished metal. And it has a very iconic feeling to it. It's minimal, it's bold, but you do feel like it's an important gate that, in fact, a deity might come through. And then these are other pieces that he did called lynch fragments. And he did these over many decades where he assembled a lot of different metal pieces. He would reshape them. He would take car parts and things that he would just find on his own and reassemble them. And all by themselves, they look pretty interesting, but together, you can see there's a lot of chains in them and a lot of pain. So I would say, here we have abstract art that absolutely has meaning. Barbara Chase Raboud is a sculptor and a sculptress. She actually went to the Tyler School of Art as an undergrad and then lived in Paris for a very long time. And I think she's back in the United States now, but her work is abstract, but also has content to it. Although in the early days she was often accused of not making work that was black enough. Unfortunately, that's a debate that often goes on for a lot of black artists. But she uses both metal and fibers because she's interested in showing the opposition of opposites: soft, hard, natural, abstract, all of those things. Showing a type of spirituality in the abstraction. This is her monument for Malcolm X, and for a lot of people, again, you look at it and you're like, well, I'm not sure how that represents Malcolm X, but she felt that it wasn't about making a monument that was like a portrait of him. It was something that was about the idea of Malcolm X. So, and she also is interested in the question of women, black women and their hair. And so she weaves in a lot of different kinds of cords, often silk, braided, in all different kinds of things. Again, to look at the association of black hair and black women. Okay, so more artist groups. Again, artists were getting together and forming groups as a means of getting themselves seen because they weren't being seen in the mainstream art world. Some were being received really well, others were not being seen at all. Again, I hope that you will read this on your own. Trying to come. Oh, this is one of my favorite pieces, which it's not on the quiz, but it's one of my favorite pieces, so I'll talk about it. Ben Jones was part of the Way You See Gallery, and he basically took plaster casts of his own face and his own arm over and over again. And you can see the arms are all a little bit different in different poses. And then he painted them all differently and then hung them on the wall. And they give you this really cool feeling of color and abstraction, while at the same time being figurative because they are his face and his arms. This is the Wall of Respect. This is part of what becomes the Great Mural movement in the United States, where there's a Wall of Respect painted in Chicago, and the Wall of Respect features lots of important African American figures. And that is actually where it is. And the danger of outdoor art, unless there's a program like there is in Philadelphia of the Mural Arts program, the danger is buildings get sold, they get demolished, things like that happen, and unfortunately the Wall of Respect is no longer there. All we have are the photographs of it. And then across the street from the Wall of Respect, we have the Wall of Truth. This is the Cobra group of artists. Again, I hope you will read about them. So many things to look at. This is one of my other favorite pieces. This is by Jeff Donaldson, who's a member of AfriCobra, and it's called Jam Packed Jelly Tight. And it's like one of those postcards they used to sell in the 90s where you'd have to look at it and then your eyes would start to go soft and you'd see an image. This one's a little bit easier to find, though. It's a bifurcated jazz player and jazz musicians. There's a singer, there's a piano player, so look very carefully at this and you'll start seeing all of those things start to emerge. Alma Thomas was one of the most recognized African American artists. She emerged in the 1960s and the 1970s, and she's mostly an abstract artist. She was influenced by fabric design. You can kind of see that. And this is one of the most famous minimalist color field paintings ever produced by an African American artist. Sam Gilliam did some really interesting things. He started out as a figurative style painter, and he started going to hard edge and color field abstractions. What do those things mean? Well, hard edge is, let me go to hard edge. This is actually by William T. Williams, but hard edge abstraction is basically what you see here. It's where the shapes and the colors have very clearly defined edges, a very flat color, and it's hard-edged. I mean, it's pretty literal. So let's go back. So Sam Gilliam started out that way, and then in 1966, I don't know if he was just playing around or what, but he first poured translucent paints on unprimed canvas. And when you do that, the color just kind of stains the surface of the canvas. It doesn't hold its edge. And so he totally got out completely of the whole thing of a painting has to be on wooden canvas stretchers. And he just started to drape his paintings around galleries. And sometimes he would even just drape them from the ceiling. So, so that was kind of an important development in abstract painting. And then William T. Williams organized an exhibit of Gilliam, Melvin Edwards, Steve Kelsey, and himself. And again, artists helping artists. And he, as I said, painted briefly these hard-edged painting surfaces. Yeah, so, and using color and line to create a visual movement, visual tension. And Alvin D. Loving also embraced hard edge painting, and he used shaped canvases instead of using rectangles. He shaped his canvases to be cubes or parallelograms or hexagons, or as you see here, septahedrons. And like a lot of abstract artists, he said, you don't need subject matter, the paint is the subject matter. So here's a story of what can happen to an artist, and this is something that also pops up on your quiz, where an artist completely changes style. He was working with these minimalist, hard edge abstract paintings, but he felt they weren't that expressive, and he was disenchanted. And so he was going to Detroit for a commission, and he stopped by the Whitney Museum in New York and saw abstract design in American quilts. And he suddenly started thinking about the quilts from his childhood that, his grandmother did, and began to feel like he really understood the quilts and the people who made them. And so he took a bunch of his paintings. Now imagine you're an artist, you have a contract with a gallery, you're supposed to have a show with them, and you take all your paintings and you cut them up. And he cut them into diamond shapes and strips, learned how to use a sewing machine, and he's quilted them back together and hung them from a ceiling or the wall. And so he's the artist who went from, abstract, hard-edged painting to creating these quilts, and they're beautiful. But what happened to him was his gallery was completely freaked out. They were expecting the hard edge version of Alvin Loving, and this was what they got, and they dropped him. They canceled his contract. Now he's okay now, but it took some time to catch on. And again, these kinds of things happen in the art world. Let's see, Thompson, interesting, but I'm going to move along. Also Raymond Sanders, interesting. Minnie Evans, folk artist, female folk artist. And I spent a lot of time on her in the slideshow because I just love her work. I love artists who are inspired by, feel that they're inspired by God to create art, and that is Minnie Evans. She feels that God basically talks to her in her dreams and visions, and then she makes these beautiful images. So she's self-trained, and she started out just on notebook paper, and she just begins to do, they're like ornate and beautiful and amazing. So she's on your quiz. Richard Hunt, sculptor, important sculptor. Do check him out. If you like his work, you might want to write a paper about him. So now we come into the 1980s. We've gone from the 60s and 70s, now we're in the 80s, and the postmodern condition. So abstract expressionism, hard edge painting, art that doesn't have content, all of this is part of modernism. And postmodernism comes out of the end of the Cold War era. It's meant to show a more pluralist culture, a move from an industry-based, industrial-based society to a computer or technological-based economy. So it's a period that we're living in after modernism, and it basically is a whole lot of types of art together. Typically modernism or postmodernism uses contemporary styles, but harkens back to something from the past. So it also might include very realist styles, but looking at them in a new way. So it changes the way that we understand art and how we define it, because now art is no longer just for art historians, curators, and collectors. Scholars from a lot of different disciplines are licensed to interpret the visual arts as cultural artifacts. And at this point in time, since the 1980s, there are more theories and critical studies being published about art, including African American art, than ever before. So I didn't really talk about performance art, but I did talk about this guy, Robert Colescott, painter. Interesting guy. He likes to look at famous paintings from art history and turn them into his own interpretations. So there's a question about him on your quiz. So here, this painting is by Van Gogh. It's an early Van Gogh called The Potato Eaters. And Robert Colescott is kind of satirical, kind of funny. He turned that painting into Eat Dem Taters, which you see on the left. And he's broadly, using some African Americans stereotypes, but it's also meant to kind of subversively appropriate, as it says on the slide, 18th, 19th, and 20th century masterpieces. So this piece here is referenced on your quiz. This is on the left. We have Les Demoiselles d'Alabama, and he's duplicating Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And basically, when Picasso painted this painting on the right, it was the painting that kind of changed the face of modernism, because Picasso painted this painting after he had gone to the Trocadero and seen African art for the very first time in his life. And so he began to paint in this abstract way that took inspiration, as you can see, from African masks. So now, and so there's a lot of differences between these paintings. Perhaps the most, well, there's several that are obvious, one of which is the women in the left are all clothed, or at least wearing bathing suits. The women on the right are naked. The women on the left, you feel looking at them that they have distinct personalities. You know, you can tell something about each woman from the way she's dressed and the way she's posed. The women on the right are very expressionless and very blank. So it's a very, I don't know, I think it's kind of liberating Les Demoiselles d'Avignon by making them into Les Demoiselles d'Alabama. And he's doing a lot of things right now. He's basically trying to, look at the dilemma that faces people who want American economic and political equality and acknowledgement of the uniqueness of, Black identity and culture. So I'm going to keep moving because we want to cover the things that you need to know the most. So, but you need to know all of it, so I hope you read it all. Michel Basquiat is somebody you may have heard of. He was a young man, close to my age, actually, or he would have been if he had lived. He died at the age of 27, unfortunately, from a heroin overdose. And he kind of had a whirlwind dream career. His artistic career, as it says there, began around 1977 when he was just going around spray painting little witty aphorisms or philosophical poems on subway cars and walls with his tag Samo on them. And he, as I said, he shot to fame. He was hanging out with people like Andy Warhol and Madonna. And I think it was a case of too much too soon. So in 1981, I don't think he was out of his 20s. That was the year I graduated high school. Oh God, you could do the math if you want to. I don't care. Anyway, he had his first show in 1981 in Modena, Italy, of all places, and then in New York at the Annina Nocé Gallery. And his style, we call it neo-expressionist. So we have expressionism, which is, the style that is, we call it expressionist because it looks as though the paint, you can see the brush marks, it was painted with intensity and with personal expression, but it was meant to be devoid of personal expression. So the neo-expressionist artists, who are postmodern, introduce a personal and subjective figural imagery into their work. And Basquiat painted and drew a lot. So when he died at the age of 27, he left behind 95 paintings and 900 works on paper. So here we have his Mona Lisa, and he's basically trying to kind of go against the idea of beauty and quality and form and purity and materials and technique. Instead, he's like taking art history, he's taking politics, he's taking autobiography and just putting them all together. And so when you see a work like this is called The Famous Moon King, and I encourage you to look it up online because I don't think this slide is that terrific. But basically, there's a lot of things. This is an intense painting. When you look at it, you might say, oh, a 5-year-old could do that. But when you start really looking at it, there are many little things written in there that tell you that there's more going on there than meets the eye. And that, my friends, is neo-expressionism. Howardina Pindell is an artist who is committed to a discourse about discrimination, sexism, colonialism, and post-colonialism, which makes her very postmodernist. She grew up in Philadelphia. She lives and teaches in I don't know where. I think she lives in Boston because she teaches at Yale. That kind of makes sense. What she is known for is she starts out as a minimalist, and she actually was using a lot of things like the dots that you get from punch dots, from paper punchers and things, and weaving them together. And then she actually did a performance work of herself called Free and White 21, where she films herself in whiteface. So that was, again, very interesting and exploring what life would be like if she were a white woman. This is the piece that she's probably best known for, and this, like, haha, this is on you're going to be on your quiz. Like Faith Ringgold, Howardina Pindell uses mixed media and sewing and so forth to bring this piece together. So this is called Autobiography, Water, Ancestors, Middle Passage, Family Ghosts. And she outlined her own body on the canvas for this. And then she stitched a lot of things that she cut up and then stitched back into the piece. So we have strips of African cloth in here. We have these written things that she stitched back into it. There are photographs from magazines and of her ancestors that are put in here. We've got the outline of the hold of a slave ship. So it's a painting that is essentially documenting her life and her family's lives in this country. And then we have Faith Ringgold, so you remember her hopefully from earlier and from my earlier slideshow. So we're now in the 80s and the 90s, and she's doing story quilts now. And of course, now she's also doing the Tonkas as well. So initially, her paintings had borders on them that were made by her mother, Willie Posey, from 1971 until her death in 1981. And then in 1977, she started writing her autobiography. And she couldn't find a publisher, so she just started to put her stories on quilts. And that began the whole thing. She also began to make a lot of dolls, such as the ones you see here. And this is a very personal work that she did where she's actually cataloging her weight loss of over 100 pounds and her thoughts and feelings about that as she's going through that process. Yeah. So I'm moving on. Yeah, so there is a penis there. Yeah. I don't mention it on your quiz. So sorry guys, I'm going to move on to this guy, Barkley Hendricks, who is on your quiz. And his work is it's outstanding. I love his work. He's from Philadelphia. He went to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. He died last year, maybe the year before that, I can't remember, but he died recently. And his portraits of the 1970s are the ones for which he is best known, where he takes African Americans, just like this gentleman here, and paints these life-sized or bigger than life-size portraits of them using techniques that would have been used in the Renaissance. And so this is his portrait of his cousin, Kathy Williams. It's called Lottie Mama. It was named after a Nina Simone song that they both liked. And he's using the same techniques as Renaissance painters. So back here behind her, this is real gold leaf. What Renaissance painters did is, you can also see if you look closely, it looks like squares. So they would have these squares of very finely hammered down to, like thinner than paper thin sheets of gold that they would then burnish onto a canvas, and then they would paint on top of that. So here he's done up his cousin in much the same way. And like a Renaissance angel, she has her afro makes a beautiful halo. And then he painted himself naked. Yeah, here we have. And he did this, I'm showing you this because it gives you a little bit of an idea also about his sense of humor. This is a work called Brilliantly Endowed Self-Portrait, and it was a response to a reviewer who looked at his artwork and said, "Oh, Barkley Hendricks is a brilliantly endowed young painter." And he might have even said black painter. So he was kind of examining the myths of artistic greatness and black male sexual prowess with this, but also, there he is. Okay. So let me see what else is included. Emma Amos. So she's also on your quiz. One of the things that there's two things you should know about Emma Amos, really. One is she was the only female member of the Spiral group of artists. And she is a feminist, whatever Faith Ringgold might have felt. She is a feminist, and she paints about feminism, race, and the black middle class in the South. And a lot of her paintings, like Faith Ringgold's and like Howardina Pindell's, include fabric. So here, this painting is called Equals, and it's a mixed media, so all along the edges she's got African fabric bordering it like a quilt. She's got an African slave shack in the background. She's got an American flag with stars, and then a self-portrait of herself looking as though she's falling out of the canvas, like literally falling out of the canvas. And that is something that she did for quite a while. She was obsessed with images of people falling or diving, and she explores that in a lot of her work. So really cool stuff. Adrian Piper, you should totally know about her, but I don't think I mentioned her in the quiz. Martin Poirier is a sculptor. Very abstract. I have to tell you the truth, I'm not as involved with abstract art as I am in figurative art. I just find figurative art a lot more interesting. That's my personal bias as your professor. But y'all might find this interesting, so do read it. Don't let me turn you off, but this is not on your test. However, I do mention Alison Saar, and Alison Saar is, as you might have guessed, the daughter of Betty Saar. And when Alison was a little girl, Betty took her to see Simon Rodia's Watts Tower. Betty was married to, and I think is still married to, Richard Saar, who's a conservator, who taught her about art materials and techniques, and she herself studied African, Latin American, and Caribbean art and religion. And so all of these things give her a very multicultural approach to both materials and art making. And so her art does appear almost folk art-like. This in particular, this is from a whole show that she did called Zombies, Totems, Rootmen, and Others. And the female figure there in particular is called Love Potion number 9. There she is. And she basically created a wooden figure that she then clothed using sealing tin that she hammered onto the figure and then painted. And then this little spot inside the figure has like a little embedded object, and it looks a lot like some artwork that you might see in Central Africa and the Congo. And Betty and Alison, I don't know if I have any pictures of it. Of course I don't. Why would I do anything like that? But what you need to know for the quiz is that Betty and Alison have worked together on a number of exhibitions, so they collaborate, and that is something you need to know for your quiz. And I'm trying to see if there's anything else. There's so many artists and so much to know, but so I do hope you will read this on your own. Photography, I barely even got into. So do take a look at all of these. Do find an artist that you think is interesting that you might want to write about. So I'm going to stop there so that I am not wearing out my voice and I'm not wearing out your patience. Isn't it nice? Auto recovery file. I will see you all soon and I hope you have a great week.